I have played a game called Gunfield, and Gunfield is a survivor's light because I had that itch that I get. It's also a reasonably traditional bullet hell shoot 'em up. So it's kind of a mixed bag of the two genres. I played about 10 hours of it now. I'm now looking to close out some of its more difficult, more specific challenges. But I think I can say with some confidence that it is a really decent game. I think it works really, really well. The mix of genres works surprisingly fluidly because you take on kind of traditional shmup stages with like a Star Fox style branching path as you get further into it. You build and then level up your ship using experience that's dropped by popcorn enemies, and then you balance shooting and dodging as you would in any traditional shooter, whilst also building a sort of automated death machine from the pool of weapons and passive upgrades as you would in any Survivors-like game. A few episodes ago, I played a game called Cozy Space Survivors.
I remember.
That also melded kind of Survivors gameplay with shooter elements, but it did so firstly with a twin stick control scheme rather than fixed scrolling stages, so it was less traditional in that sense. And it also lent a lot more into being kind of a very soft mission-based RPG rather than a traditional shmup where it's kind of like you do a run to the end, you either win or you lose kind of thing. I liked it a lot for what it was, but I like Gunfield quite a lot more because it demands much more attention through needing you to actually draw upon skills that you associate first and foremost with the parent genre. You know, it is still a shoot 'em up. It just happens to have an upgrade system from Survivors games. If you don't pay attention to your movement, you're not going to survive. And especially when it comes to the last achievements that I'm going for at the moment, which are all damageless boss battles with kind of major endgame meanies, you're just not going to make any progress unless you understand how to read the bullet patterns and learn how to get around them and stuff like that. No matter your kind of warhorse of a build, you still need to know the fundamentals. I'm still genuinely and hugely impressed that the Survivors-like subgenre has had the legs that it has. But I think it's because it fundamentally tickles such a base part of our rat brains because it's got that kind of little and often rewards sort of trigger dopamine delivery system. And what I'm perhaps more impressed by, though, in playing something like Gunfield or still playing like Temtem Survivors with Georgia and stuff like that, is that I don't think I've found any other game that beats Vampire Survivors at its own game. It's still the best game to do this. And that's quite impressive, like a few years on now. Every game I've played seems to excel in one area, and you go, wow, that's great, but it misses somewhere else.
Yeah.
So Temtem Swarm, like I just said, Georgia and I are picking through. We're playing kind of a few runs here and there. She's got really into it and is now playing it when I'm not even in the house. You know, she's really, really picked it up. It's got great character, but it feels a bit listless in kind of the back-end admin, whereas Vampire Survivors was like, I have a great time playing it. I love the metagame. I love all the stuff in between. Like, there weren't any weak links for me. Gunfield successfully transplants much of kind of the Vampire's formula into this new genre, but perhaps doesn't have the longevity that I'd like because of the inherent limitations of shooters, because they are pattern-based. They need to be learnable. So you will get bored eventually because it can't be as big as like the original Vampire Survivors. Over the last couple of years, I've mentioned a lot of these on the show in passing. I've played and enjoyed, this is a non-exhaustive list, Beautiful Mystic Survivors, Goobies, Wedding Witch, Twilight Survivors, Brotato, Malignant Survivors, probably loads of others, but none of them seem to hit the home run of their inspiration. And so Vampire Survivors remains, if we're being totally honest, it's basically the be-all and end-all of this subgenre of action roguelikes because no one else seems to be able to connect authentically to that framework, you know, that's subscribing to the little and often reward system, remaining really accessible because that game is understandable within 5 seconds of playing, still having kind of the build depth to reward meta thought, and whilst also keeping its own unique direction with like a distinct audiovisual aesthetic, because as much as it looks kind of ropey in places, Vampire Survivors owns that aesthetic, and it has consistently right up until now that it's, you know, had many, many updates. It's linked with many, you know, popular franchises, everything else. They're still doing it their way, which is quite exciting that they've really just owned it. I keep trying basically every copycat that releases because I really do enjoy the loop that these games provide. But even when I get really stuck in, like I've done with Gunfield, it's impossible not to think in the back of my head, could just start a new game with Vampire Survivors, which is where I'm at the moment. As I get towards the end of Gunfield, I'm like, I never finished all the DLC stuff. There's so much to do. I could just wipe my Steam save and start again. So that's on the cards maybe for February.
You haven't played Halls of Torment, have you?
No.
That's
I know
really
you really
good.
recommended that one.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll bump that up the list as well. It may well be in my Steam library. You know,
It
all
almost
these things
certainly is.
I buy them because you recommend them or someone else recommends them, and then they go on sale and I go, £2, I'm actually losing money not to have this, which is not true.
That's true.
I understand how economics works.
That is true.
But in my mind,
and also, if you buy it for £2, you've technically saved £15.
Don't
you
do
may
it.
as well spend
Don't
that
do it, because
£15 as well.
That is exactly how my brain works. It's exactly how my brain works. That in my mind, I'm like, I would like this thing. It's £40. It's only 20. Well, I've just gained 20 every single time.
£20.
It's like I feel so rich. I feel so rich. And yeah, that has been the same since I was a child, right through to now, approaching 40 years old.
Oh, God.
Dear me. I mean, you've just mentioned a load of kind of Balatro adjacent type card games, things like that. With Balatro's success, especially in the end of year lists of 2024, I'm fully expecting that to be the next game, like Vampire Survivors, that now has 2-3 years of copycats, clones, genre mashups, and they will flood Steam and they will flood mobile and everything else pretty hard, I'd say, over the next year or two. But what's the betting that none of them actually scratched quite the same itch as Balatro?
Of course they won't.
Because both those games have been proper like lightning in a bottle stuff, I think, for very small teams of one person in Balatro, I think 3 people at Ponkle for Vampire Survivors, to make these kind of just unbelievably...
One for each of the frames of animation.
Yeah. But they both teams have created like these unbelievably disruptive indie projects that have had far more kind of influence and will ripple through the industry in a way that most other big AAA stuff just will not at the moment. It just will not cut through in that way. So yeah, Vampire Survivors great. Gunfield, I'm enjoying a lot. Not quite as great. Balatro, even though I'm rubbish at it, even though I played a tiny portion of what you played, also great. And it's just interesting to see how these things actually spiral out and kind of create this just forever waterfall of similar experiences that just don't quite drip in the right way.